Absolutely. Now we get into chapter 18. Let's go down south to Hezekiah.
King of Judah.
He is now the king of Judah. Hezekiah is one of the greatest kings in the history of the kingdom of Judah. He's really powerful and righteous, and you're going to see his example in the face of intense opposition. You're going to see him repeatedly turning to the Lord and trusting the prophet, in his case, Isaiah, which, by the way, that had to be really a neat experience for Hezekiah to get to be the king with Isaiah as his court prophet. This was a privilege for both Hezekiah and for Isaiah, because in the Old Testament, many times the prophets were like the least popular guy in the kingdom, and he would have to be on the run just to save his life, to keep running from the king who would always be trying to kill him up north or down south. In this case, it's kind of unique because Isaiah gets to be this court prophet with Hezekiah especially, where he gets great privileges living in the king's court and kind of as a close, trusted advisor, counselor. And you're going to see this beautiful relationship between these two, the king and the prophet, as we move forward into this story. So we've been talking about all these rough experiences with wicked kings. Let's celebrate for a minute some of these good verbs associated with Hezekiah. He started his reign when he was 25 years old, and he's going to be the king for 29 years. Look what it says in verse 3. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. Look at verse 5. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel. Verse 6. He clave to the Lord. He departed not from following him. He kept his commandments, which the Lord commanded Moses. Back to what Taylor began with. We keep going back to this Torah. He's keeping the commandments. He's not rewriting what Moses received from God. He's saying, that's what I'm going to do. And notice the response. Everything in verse 3 through 6 was what Hezekiah did with the help of the Lord. Look what the Lord does. Verse 7, and the Lord was with him, and he prospered whithersoever he went forth. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not.
Basically saying, I'm not going to serve the Assyrian gods. I'm trusting that God, as the Lord of hosts, will protect me. As I am faithful to God, God will protect me from this onslaught of foreigners who want to impose their barbaric practices on us.
So, here's the problem. The king of Assyria has wiped out multiple countries, multiple kingdoms, overthrown multiple gods and idols on his conquest. And he wiped out Syria, just to the north. He's wiped out Israel. And here's the question for you to ponder for a moment. If you turn your life over to the devil, if you serve the devil, or you serve just the natural man tendencies that we all have in a fallen world, the question to consider is, when is enough enough? When do you arrive at that point where you say, okay, I don't need any more, whether it be money or fame or power or land or followers or conquests or any of the pleasures of life. If you turn your life over to the devil, when do you reach that saturation point where you say, I'm good, I'm going to stop there? The scriptures are full of examples of people who get so power hungry in this case. They can't stop. They just keep going, trying to have more conquest, get more, which is one of those interesting attributes of the mortal fallen condition, is it doesn't come naturally to be content with what the Lord gives us. If we're not careful, we'll always be comparing ourselves to other kings around us and say, oh, I need more, or I need more power, or I need more money, more taxes, whatever it may be. And in this case, he didn't stop at the border of Israel and Judah. He kept going. And he ends up wiping out and sieging and taking out all of the cities. In the scriptures, you're going to see the phrase over and over again, the fenced cities of Israel and the fenced cities of Judah. That doesn't mean that they've got picket fences around them. That means these big, massive walls, usually. And one of the biggest cities down here, so Jerusalem's the capital, but one of the biggest cities here in the kingdom of Judah is Lachish. So here we go. We're going to retell the taking of Samaria in verse 9 through 12. Just so we get the context, it's kind of getting back up to speed. We've lost the kingdom of Israel, and he keeps coming into the kingdom of Judah. And verse 13 tells you, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So in verse 14, it tells us that he went to Lachish, and Lachish is one of the biggest cities, a big stronghold in the kingdom of Judah, and it falls. And it's a sad day when you lose the light shining from Lachish.
Archaeologists have spent considerable time here and have found so many like spearheads and arrowheads and like ballistic rocks that were used to be thrown at the walls to knock down the walls. I mean, this was clearly one of the worst destructions. And this is a very, very substantial city. And when this falls, everybody knows it. So you imagine the people in Jerusalem are now have shaky knees potentially. And it's interesting as we read Isaiah and the story of Hezekiah, how do people respond when death and mayhem seem to be right on their doorsteps?
Which is a really good lesson for us today as we maybe face some opposition and maybe you see some pillars of strength around you falling and struggling and under siege, and it can be intimidating. But I love these chapters because you'll notice you don't help people who are struggling under siege by throwing wide open the gates and inviting the enemy in and saying, okay, I surrender. That doesn't help anybody, much less you and your loved ones. To stay faith and firmly rooted in your covenantal connection with Christ is the only hope. Even if all of the other fenced cities around you are falling, you stay faithful. You stay true to those covenantal connections that you have with the Lord. So what happens is there's one city left in the entire kingdom that hasn't fallen, and it's Jerusalem. And now we've wiped out all these other cities in Judah, and so Sennacherib now turns his attention full force. Let's go and siege the city of Jerusalem, and that's going to be the final city in Judah. And so he sends this servant, Rabshakeh, with some others to deliver his message. And boy, they, like we said before, the Assyrians, they taunt with terror. And they're going to be showing the conquests of the conquered peoples and what they've done to torture them. And they're trying to get these people so scared that they give up because of these threats.
In fact, even Rabshakeh, the messenger from the Assyrian king, speaks in Hebrew, not as in his own language, because he's trying to get all the people, all the defenders in the walls of the city of Jerusalem to hear these menacing and terrifying words. And the men of Hezekiah, like the leaders, are like, we understand the Assyrian language. You can speak to us in your tongue, because they're trying to keep the people from hearing these like terrible taunts. And how many of us, when we get verbally attacked by people who are not our friends, might feel discouraged? And that's why it's important we go to church, we read the scriptures and listen to the words of prophets. We hear the language of God instead of the language of the enemy that's lying to us or saying things to distract us from what's good, wholesome, and beautiful.
And part of their message is, you are all crazy for following Hezekiah, your king, who's promising you to be delivered by his God. And then they go through this long list. Look at verse 33. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered at all his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and of Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, Iva? And they're listing all these different countries and kingdoms that they've wiped out. And they're like, where are their gods? They didn't save those people. These messengers are very, very unfamiliar with the Lord God of Israel, obviously. So watch Hezekiah's response. Chapter 19 is beautiful. It opens with verse 1. It came to pass that when King Hezekiah heard it, that he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went where? Into the house of the Lord. You'll notice things are heating up. The siege is going to start. The people are starting to get really nervous. They're seeing what's happened everywhere else. They're saying, what are we going to do? And he went to the temple to connect with God. Verse 2, he sent Eliakim, which was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos. So he goes to the temple, and he sends messengers to the prophet. We need every connecting point we can with the Lord here to know what to do.
I love verse 6. And Isaiah said unto them, once he's gotten to the temple and he's in he's joined this meeting, thus shall ye say to your master, thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of King Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. That's not a lot of words, but boy, is there so much strength and optimism packed into just 2 verses.
So he wrote that letter to Hezekiah. The messengers deliver it to Hezekiah. He gets the letter, he reads it, and he says, I'm gonna take this. Look at verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter of the hand of the messengers, and he read it. And then he went up into the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. That's a really, really interesting turn of events. That God speaks to a prophet because you've humbled yourself and petitioned him for an answer. You've turned to the Lord for help. The Lord has poured out a direct message to his prophet. The prophet delivers the message to you. And then what do? You take that message to the temple, so to speak, to this sacred space, and you spread it before the Lord. And he says, O Lord God of Israel, which dwellest between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Lord, bow down thine ear and hear. Open, Lord, thine eyes and see. And hear the words of Sennacherib, which hath sent him to reproach the living God. And so he's taking this message to the Lord saying, what do I do? What a beautiful pattern that you get messages from the prophets, but you don't just stop there. You take it to the Lord and say, now how do I live this? How do I do this? Whether the prophets are the modern prophets or as you're reading scriptures, to take the written words of the Lord that have come to us through his mouthpieces, what a powerful thing to ask him for that guidance.
So you'd think that God, who's the Lord of hosts, would say, all right, I'm going to send this big, massive army. I'm going to send in reinforcements from Egypt, or there's a bunch of people out on the land that you didn't know about. They're going to come deliver you. Now, God could have done that. But God chose something a bit more powerful and memorable to impress upon the minds of his people that he has chosen his people and this city where his holy house is.